Um, so, Hi everyone, welcome to our masterclass with Graham. My name is Tony, and I am the director of QWave. If you're a new member, um, QWave is the music production club at Queens, and we offer free resources like this, masterclasses, weekly tutorials, and if you haven't checked out our studio yet, please go. It's free for members to book. And just a quick announcement, we have another masterclass coming up on March 5th, and that will be in person. And so if you're into experimental music or just DJ in sampling or turntables, that's definitely your class. And without further ado, let's welcome Graham. Um, so I'll just let Graham introduce himself and he will take it from here.
That's great. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. My name is Graham Lessard, and I'm coming to you today from Calgary, which is where I've been living for about the last 7 or 8 years. And I'm a music producer and a recording engineer and a mixer. And maybe at some point today, I'll talk a little bit about the differences between those roles and then maybe some of the similarities too, because the longer that I do this, the less I differentiate between any of those specific activities. To me, it's all part of the production pathway, if you like. But it's all production, start to finish, of a music recording. And I'll start by telling you a little bit about me. And when I was in university studying an unrelated field, and I had been doing music for, I guess, probably, you know, 10 years or so at that point. Playing guitar is how I got started, being active in music, but for much longer, I'd been an active music fan and listener of music. And, and I can sort of directly trace what I do professionally now to listening to my parents' record collection and going through all of the sleeves and reading all of the lyrics and then reading about the band members and reading the technical credits and thinking I can actually remember clearly looking at the liner notes in a Bruce Springsteen record and thinking, mixing engineer, Bob Clearmountain. I don't know what that is, but it sounds like it's a cool job. And I was right, it's a cool job. So from university, like I said, I was studying an unrelated field, and it was not really, it was becoming more clear that that was not going to be a professional jumping off point for me. I took some time off from my degree and went to London, Ontario, to an audio training school called the Ontario Institute of Audio Recording Technology, which is where I got my formal audio training. And it was a 1 year program. And I sort of had thought when I moved to Ontario from Alberta, I'm from Edmonton originally, that I would, move to Toronto afterwards and try and work in a studio. But as I got closer to finishing the program at OIART, I realized that I knew tons of musicians in Edmonton, from playing music there in bands and things like that, and from friends at university and high school. And I sort of thought, well, maybe I should just go back to Edmonton and start recording my friends, which is what I did, starting with a studio that I put together in my parents' basement. And sort of using that as a jumping off point. I mean, I ran the studio in their basement for quite a while before I moved out and moved it into a basement in a house that I was renting. And along the way, quite a few actually, other studios too, which I can go into some more detail on in a sec here. But I think the point that I'm trying to make here about my own background is that it's a mixture of formal training and then much more self-taught as well, from just jumping into the work. And like a lot of freelancers, when you start by doing something you love and suddenly you get a call or a DM from someone offering to pay you to do it, it's kind of like the light bulb goes on. and and I've never really looked back. I've had a lot of twists and turns since then, but that's sort of how I got my start. I should say too that in terms of the technology that I use as a recording engineer, I mean, although I have my own favorite tools, and a lot of them tend to be a bit old-fashioned or vintage, I mostly, like, I'm on a computer every day making music and recording music using state-of-the-art digital technology. But I started actually with a cassette 4-track before I was doing it professionally. Just that's really how I got interested in the idea of recording audio and recording music. And those tools are pretty primitive looking now, but I still sort of remember fondly the feeling of playing back something that I had recorded. And I mean, I was under no illusions that it was a complete professional sounding product, but it was inspiring enough to make me want to continue chasing it, which I still feel like I chase every day, trying to make things sound better. And better can mean a lot of different things. So I mentioned that I had taken a few other twists and turns there and worked in some other studios. Another really important part of my training in music recording and production and mixing was through a training program at the Banff Center. And if you've never heard of it, I would really encourage you to check it out if you're considering, some professional training in the field of audio. The Banff Center, of course, is a world famous arts incubator in the Rockies, not too far away from where I live here in Calgary. And as part of the, well, I suppose it started as part of the music program and since became its own recognized program. The audio program there is really almost as close as you can find to an apprenticeship, which is, of course, how the studio system used to work. You would get a job at a studio, probably answering the phones, going to buy cigarettes and coffee, and keeping the room clean. And eventually, you might get asked to plug in a microphone, and could work your way up to being an assistant engineer over a period of years, studying on the job until you were, suddenly the person in the chair running the session. I'm sure probably most of you know that's not how professional audio recording works anymore. I mean, there are those positions, but they're vanishingly rare because so much music production has moved into home studios. And a home studio can be anything from like a modest setup like what I had in my folks' basement to a pretty fully realized production facility that happens to be in somebody's house. But the big difference is that there's not a lot of commercial studios that hire assistant engineers or that have engineers on salary. So that's a pretty rare opportunity, and it's a big change to the way that the skills in professional audio were taught and have developed. Audio recording, that is. Where was I going with this? But the program at the Banff Center that I was lucky enough to take part in a couple of times and eventually went back to supervise is akin to what I just described, where there's a very nice professional studio in the Banff Center that was developed as part of the audio training program and for the musicians that come to Banff to write or rehearse or to record music. And so at the time it was called a work study program. It was a work study in Banff for, I guess about 4 months. It was a 4-month term there. I should say, actually, even before that, I had started working for CBC Radio, not doing music primarily, but I knew that I wanted to work with some of the recording engineers at CBC who did music, and my way in to the CBC was by working in a radio studio, running the board for talk shows for the CBC's local morning and afternoon shows in Edmonton. And I wanted to do that because I knew that there were some recording engineers at CBC that specialized in music. And I thought if I worked in the studios running the talk shows, I might get a chance to go out and assist on some music recordings, which is what ended up happening. So from there, I realized that I was just so hungry to learn, and that my training at OIART, while sort of fantastic for fundamentals, really didn't touch much on the aesthetics of music recording. And it's kind of funny to say, but I didn't realize at the time that it's such a craft. And by that I mean the technical requirements and skills and equipment is absolutely an important part of the work. You can't do it without those things. But much like music and music theory, the more you know, the better off you are in a way, the more potential you have, maybe, to use those ideas. But it really comes down to practice and creativity and a lot of skills or traits that are not teachable, that have to be developed through hours and hours and years of doing the work. And I realized that I needed to log way more hours working with more musicians, and Banff was amazing for that. I actually went back there a couple of years later for the same reason, just to get exposure to more kinds of music and more musicians, and keep training my ear and keep getting new ideas for how to record and how to use the equipment that I was getting more and more familiar with. So I feel like I kind of launched into this, but I didn't really describe much about what it is that I actually do. And so if this is a new field for you, I'm going to take a second here and just tell you a little bit about what I started off with when I said I'm a music producer, and I'm a recording engineer, and I'm a mixer. Pretty much everything I've just been talking about for the last 10 minutes, I think, is really directly related to being a recording engineer. And what is that? In my case, it's mostly recording acoustic-based music, meaning music that you record with microphones, as opposed to, say, building tracks with a sampler or in a DAW. It mostly involves microphones and musicians performing on acoustic instruments. Now, there's definitely an element of electronic instrumentation in lots of the albums that I work on. But all of the training I've just described, a heavy focus was on acoustic recording, which is at its most fundamental, choosing an appropriate microphone and putting it in the right place and recording with good solid levels, and then balancing all of those tracks that you record against one another and now we're starting to get into the world of mixing. And it's all, as I said, it's sort of a part of production. Now, a producer in this world that I'm describing is a little bit different also, I think, than what you might imagine if you're thinking about producer in the context of, say, a hip hop record or dance music or an electronic production, where the producer is, in a way, the songwriter or the person that makes the backing track before a lyricist, lays down vocals. Music producer, in the sense that I use it, is a contributor to that, certainly. But it can be as simple as sort of running the logistics for a session in terms of running the budget, hiring the musicians, booking the studio, and then making sure that the project runs on budget and on time, and that you get done what you need to get done in a certain amount of time. That's a bit of an old school way of describing a producer, but it still has relevance, especially when you have groups of musicians and professional studio time that you are paying for. And then there's definitely an opportunity in a lot of the work that I do for creative contributions as well, although it's rarely as sort of comprehensive as a producer that makes a track that then, a rapper will record vocals over top of, for example. Okay, I'm going to talk just for a second about I had said earlier when I was talking with Tyler and Tony about doing this talk that I would halfway through talk about the National Music Center, but I think I'm going to go there now because, in a way, it's a trip sitting here talking to a black screen, monologuing for 20 minutes. Believe me, this is like more uninterrupted talking than I usually do in a whole day. So I'm going to talk about the NMC, the National Music Center, where I am currently the studio manager. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour of a couple of those spaces, which I think will be a good jumping off point for talking about some of the tools and techniques that I employ. And the sooner that we can get into your questions, probably the better for all of us. So to keep the chronology straight, after I had been working at CBC Radio for a few years, and I had been to the Banff Center a couple of times as a practicum participant or a work study to train, continue my training. My wife and I moved to Montreal actually for a few years. And the reason for that, we had friends out there and were ready for a change of scene, but also a big part of that move was because there's such an incredible music scene in Montreal. And I just knew that, again, I needed to work with more musicians. I needed more exposure to different kinds of music. I needed to work in more studios and learn about equipment and hopefully try and work with more producers and engineers, because one of the problems with that, with the deterioration or the loss of that apprenticeship system that I was describing, is that a lot of people are kind of on their own, and it's a much longer, shallower learning curve. Steeper in some ways, I suppose, because you're trying to make sense of things on your own that you would otherwise be familiar with just from watching someone beside you do them. But when I say it's a shallower curve, I mean that there's just so much more trial and error involved when you're not in a room with someone that's been doing it for longer than you. It's sort of like, I often think about it, because at this point I have a lot of experience teaching audio as well and teaching recording and mixing. I often think of it like sports, and imagine if you were teaching yourself to play tennis by yourself, knocking the ball against the wall, it's going to take a long time. But if you're playing against somebody that's better than you, you're going to have to come up to that skill level much more quickly. Otherwise, they're going to stop taking your calls to book a game, right? so, so anyway, after a few years in Montreal, I was very fortunate there. My friends were involved in music, and weirdly, as an Anglophone and a musician, I sort of found myself quite quickly in a very small community and being asked to participate and make recordings. And I was assisting a couple of producers and working in some great studios. And I was able to get a lot of experience out there and work on some really great projects, make some really great friends and future clients. While we were out there, though, a job opportunity came up at the Banff Center to go and supervise the program that I had participated in several times. And so I threw my hat in the ring. It was actually, that job came up twice while I was living in Montreal. And the second time it came up, I was hired. And so we moved back to Alberta, and I spent the next 5 years working at the Banff Center and supervising this training program. And from there, we moved to Calgary, and a couple of years after moving, and I was all this whole time I was trying to maintain a profile as a freelance recording engineer and producer and mixer. So I was traveling for work sometimes and doing some teaching as well, and outside of Banff, that is. And a couple of years after moving to Calgary, I started working for the National Music Center, which, as I said, I currently manage the studios there. I work for the NMC part-time. About half my work week is spent there managing the studios, managing the staff recording engineers there, and doing various other things that I'll get into. But if you haven't heard of the National Music Center before, it's a really amazing place in Calgary. It's in a very fancy, quite new building downtown. The building is, I believe, 7 years old now, and I've been working there for 5 years. And I'm sorry, maybe the building's 8 years old. And it is a museum on one side of the street. It's the home for music in Canada, we like to say. And so there are 5 floors full of incredible artifacts, costumes, awards, instruments related to the history of Canadian music, several music halls of fame in the building. And that's the part that's open to the public, and it's just an amazing resource in the city of Calgary. There's tens of thousands of school kids that go through the museum every year, and I just think it's incredible for the future of music in Calgary and Canada, but in particular Calgary, for all of these kids to be exposed to this great legacy of Canadian music from the 20th century and forward. On the other side of the street, there are 3 floors of state-of-the-art recording studios. That's where I work, and I feel incredibly lucky because we just have amazing facilities and amazing staff, and it's just an incredible place to come and make recordings. And the reason those studios exist is because of something called our living collection. So the living collection refers to the instruments in NMC's collection that are meant to be used, played, and recorded. And this is something that's really different from most museums, where you have incredible artifacts, well preserved behind glass with maybe a plaque that has some of the history of that artifact. We do have those at the NMC in the public side of the building, and then the living collection of instruments is where you actually get to use the artifacts, right? The way that they were intended to be used. So that ranges from, a 450-year-old Italian harpsichord is the oldest instrument in our living collection, right up to, maybe some of you have already seen Tonto, which is a modular synthesizer most famously used by Stevie Wonder for some of his late 60s and early 70s recordings. And those instruments in the living collection used to be, not all of them, but some of them used to be in the public galleries in the old location of National Music Center back when it was still called the Cantos Foundation. And you could record them there by special arrangement, but it was, as I say, in a public gallery, and so you'd have to go in after hours and work with staff, and there would be, like this sort of mobile Pro Tools cart that you would, Pro Tools, if you don't know, is a digital audio workstation. That's what we currently use in our studios as well. It's arguably the standard platform for acoustic music recording. Anyhow, you would roll this Pro Tools mobile rig around the gallery and record instruments. It was quite ad hoc. In other words, it wasn't a purpose-built studio. And when the Cantos Foundation acquired land downtown, was rebranding as National Music Center, there was a big opportunity there. And my current boss, who's the director of collections and exhibitions at the National Music Center, thought, wouldn't it be great to have spaces where we could preserve these instruments, humidity control. That's a big thing in Calgary. If you haven't been here, there's not much humidity. It's quite dry, which is, death for acoustic instruments like pianos and things, and stable temperatures. And if I'm going to build these facilities with these safe facilities to preserve the instruments, maybe those should be recording studios so that they could actually be recorded the way that they were always meant to be recorded, in the best possible conditions. And that's what happened. We have 3 incredible live rooms, 3 incredible control rooms. The studio facility was designed by an architect from Toronto that specializes in studio design called Martin Pilchner. And all of the rooms are wired such that you can use them in combination with any of the rooms, in combination with any of the other. If you're not familiar with a traditional studio layout, a control room is probably what you're thinking of here when I say recording studio. It's got, like a big recording console that looks like something out of the cockpit of the space shuttle, and some big speakers. We have those. And then a live room is the performance space. It's where the band sets up, or the orchestra, or the singer, or whatever you're recording that day. So it's performance space. In the old days, and luckily enough, the National Music Center, a live room was acoustically designed to enhance the sound of the instruments. It's designed to keep bad sound out of the room. So every recording studio in the world is pretty close to a set of train tracks, just like us. The studio design is such that we don't really hear the train much unless you're recording something really quiet. And to keep the good sound in too, so that, we've got 2 floors of offices below our recording studio. For the most part, they don't hear what we get up to during the day. Every now and then there's something really loud that, will blow the accountant's hair back. But for the most part, the bad sound stays out of our rooms and the good sound stays in. And they're designed with a mixture of absorptive and reflective surfaces. You get just the right amount of natural sounding reverb so that it's not doesn't sound like it was recorded in a broom closet, but on the other hand, you can control how much reverb there is on the sound by how close you place the microphones. So I think that's quite enough of me chattering. I think these guys have sent you out some links, so maybe if you have those handy, I'm going to ask you to pull them up. I'm going to do the same on my end here. And we're going to click the link to something called Live Room A.
Graham, do you want to share your screen?
Oh, that's probably the best way to do it. Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? Is that something that I would activate on my end, or is that something that you can do from your end?
I think I should have given you access. Do you have a share option?
Let me check this out. Yeah, sure do. Okay, so I think that would be, hang on 1 second here, guys. Just gonna I'm gonna have to see if I can get around, if I can get through the NMC permissions to do this, but I think, oops.
Yeah, if it's too complicated, then no worries. I believe everybody has the links.
I think I'm this close. I just had to, you know, dual
Okay.
factor and then show the phone my face.
Sure. So,
All right. Maybe not. No, it's just, I think I'm in a bit of a loop here. Record the contents of your screen. Yeah, I don't think it's going to let me. Sorry about that. It's a good try. All right, so tell you what, then we'll just wander together into Live Room A. And this is our largest recording space. You can see on the left side there, when you enter into the room, there's quite a few electric pianos and transistor organs. At the far end, a grand piano, and then on the right-hand side, it looks like some more organs. That red sort of piano-looking thing, if you haven't seen one before, that's a harpsichord. So a predecessor to a piano, kind of the ancestor of the piano. And then another electric piano there. And in this space, in this format, you can just click the mouse where you'd like to go and sort of wander around. If you were to head towards the window, you'll see a couple of booths in the corner that can fold into the wall. So those are what we call isolation booths, mainly used for recording vocals, but really the purpose is to separate one sound source from another. So let me give you an example. Let's say you've got a jazz quartet. So piano, bass, drums, and some kind of lead instrument, maybe a vocalist or maybe a saxophone, something like that. In that scenario, not all of the instruments play equally loudly, right? I'm sure everybody can recognize right away the drum set's going to be louder than a vocalist. And it's going to be louder than a piano that's playing quietly or, at a medium dynamic. And it's going to be way louder than an acoustic bass. A string bass is a beautiful instrument, but it's kind of a nightmare from a recording engineer point of view because it's so quiet compared to most of the instruments that it accompanies. So in that kind of a scenario in a room like this, having isolation booths in the room is great for controlling sound because you can put a bass in one of these booths and you can put probably your lead instrument, whether it's a vocal or sax, trumpet, whatever, in another booth. And then you can protect the sound of those instruments and protect the microphones you're using to record those instruments from the unwanted sound, which we would call spill or bleed or leakage, from the drums or the piano. Now, the drums and piano, it's true, will end up in that same large room together. But with some careful positioning of the microphones, you can mitigate the spill, the leakage, and you can also use that to your advantage. Like if you think about recordings from especially the first half of the 20th century, but really even up until the 80s, so many of those recordings were made with musicians playing together in a room. And spill was just accepted and incorporated into the sound, where it was really about capturing a performance. So much of the time today we think about, and I think this is a legacy of production techniques that started to really emerge during the 1980s. We think about, building up songs one track at a time. But there's a long history of recorded music and really great sounding recorded music where musicians are performing live together, and it's in a way like taking a photograph, or recording, like filming a stage production where all the action unfolds live in real time, and you're trying to capture it as best as possible to make it feel like you were there. So that is a type of recording that we are able to do in a room like this, that you really can't do in a basement studio. Now, you could actually record a jazz quartet in a pretty small space. And speaking of home studios, a very famous home studio in Hackensack, New Jersey, was the home of a lot of really famous jazz recordings from the 60s. The recording engineer called Rudy Van Gelder for the Blue Note label in particular, but other labels too. And so there's also this long history of recording music in sort of made up studio facilities. And so although I'm lucky enough to work in a big studio much of the time, I still like recording in small spaces and kind of ad hoc spaces, because they lend themselves to different things and different budgets, which is really important. Okay, I kind of wandered off track there in this room though. I was going to, I think, just show you a few of these instruments. Hopefully you've had a chance while I've been talking to take a look around the room yourself. When we shot this 3D tour, we had a drum kit set up in the room as well with some of the microphones. And not only the instruments in this room, but also the recording equipment are part of the living collection. So if we were to walk over to the drum kit, oh man, I just went right past it. You can see, maybe I won't dwell too much on the specific gear, but that's a 1960s Ludwig drum kit. It's part of our living collection. And in this photo, we're using a ribbon mic from the 1930s as an overhead, and a German condenser mic, a Neumann FET 47 in front of the bass drum. That would be 1960s vintage. And there's probably one or two other mics set up there too, which I can't see at the moment, but it's just a way of saying that this is something I'm lucky enough to do every day. It's kind of weird in the field of music recording to, 60 or 100 years after this technology was developed, still prize those tools for their sound. I think in a lot of other fields, it's all about the latest and greatest, where in music recording, for a lot of professionals and a lot of studios and a lot of musicians, it's actually vintage gear that is prized as much or more in some cases than modern tools, for various reasons. I like to think it's because they, at the time that they were developed, they just got it right, and the tools worked really well and sounded amazing. And there's also a school of thought that would say it's because a lot of the recordings that we're familiar with were made, decades before using some of these tools, and so we like them because they have a familiar sound. Be that as it may, I like using the old gear, and I like using new stuff too. I love recording to computers. Lets you work much more quickly. And I have spent a fair amount of time in my life recording to tape machines, not just the 4-track Porta Studio that I mentioned, but professional 24-track tape machines, which are really fun and really good at what they do. But unless you're simply recording live takes off the floor with the band playing together, it's actually quite a bit faster to record to a computer. As soon as you start doing overdubs or punch-ins or wanting to comp or edit together multiple takes, doing that on nonlinear digital recording system is much faster. Okay, just quickly in the room while we're here, I'll point out a couple things. By the way, I encourage you to go back to these spaces if you're interested and look around. You'll see little red icons in a few places. That'll tell you about some of these instruments on view in any of the rooms. I'll just point out one in the corner that's one of my favorites. It's this white organ looking instrument. Maybe just take a minute so everybody can find that. It doesn't look as fancy as some of the other instruments, but it is one of the most rare instruments in our living collection. That's a Hammond Nova chord. And so it's made by Hammond, the same company that makes the B3 organ. As you can see, there's a B3 right beside it, which is pretty recognizable. It's a studio staple in a recording studio to have a B3 organ. Classic jazz instrument, funk, soul, blues, came from the church, of course, the organ that is, and was incorporated into those styles of music. But Hammond, 20 years before, in fact, they made the B3, which comes from 1959. They had this instrument called the Nova chord, which is not an organ, although it looks like one. It's actually a polyphonic, meaning multiple voices synthesizer from 1939. So state of the art in 1939. There's over 150 vacuum tubes. If there's any guitar players here, you'll know what a vacuum tube is. It's usually 7 or 8 in a good guitar amp. Well, there's 150 in this Hammond Nova chord to give you full polyphony, or multiple voices across the keyboard, and all the way from 1939. So there's only, I'm told, 6 of those left in the world that are playable anymore. And they never made that many to begin with, only 1,000 or so. It wasn't a really successful product for the Hammond company, not like the B3 that really took off and stuck around. But the Hammond Nova chord is a special, I think, gem in this room and in the NMC's collection. And we record it fairly regularly. And put it this way, I'll record it any chance I get because it's a really cool sounding instrument. Just keeping an eye on the clock here, guys. I think I've chattered on a little longer than I intended, but I think I'm just going to wander out of Live Room A here, and if you'll bear with me, let's click into Control Room A, in that same list of links. Trident Control Room A is what the link says. I'm just going to go here so you can see what it's like on the other side of the glass. Now, this is actually on a different floor from Live Room A, so we don't have a window between the control room and the live room, which is something you do see in, I would say, most professional studios. But instead, you can see here there's a television screen in front of that console. And on that screen, you can see the room that we just left. You can see that piano with the window behind it. So that's our visual cue system. It's a closed circuit digital video system, two-way. So from the live room, you can see into the control room as well, that we can use to connect any of these spaces together. And just briefly, this big purple console is a Trident A range, hence the Trident control room. It's one of only 13 of these consoles that are built. Again, very rare piece. And it comes from Trident Studios in London in the 1970s. And we use it on a daily basis. This is where we have most of our recording sessions based out of Control Room A. And I should have mentioned earlier when I said that all of the rooms are connected so you can use them together. In a brand new building, it would make a lot of sense to use fiber optic cable to run digital audio between rooms in the building. And in a lot of modern multi-room studio facilities, that's how you would do it. Because these studios, though, are built around consoles from the 60s and 70s, from a fully analog paradigm, it's actually just thousands of feet of copper wire that link all these spaces together. Real old school. And in fact, if you look at the left-hand side of this console, zoom in, you'll see a patch bay or a jack field that looks like something out of an old movie where, someone places a phone call and has to get the operator to connect them through a switchboard. That's exactly what that patch bay is. And we have these patch bays in all of our studio spaces to connect the rooms together. So in a way, going into any of these rooms is a trip back in time, even though, as you can see the computer right beside it, we're also using modern state-of-the-art digital tools at the same time. So I think that's enough from me. I know that I'm bored to tears of hearing myself talk. I would love if anybody has some questions. I think we have time for at least some of those now, and it would be great to speak to some of the things that you're interested in. So I'm turning it over to you guys. Or maybe to you, Tony, if you want people to ask questions in the chat, and you can ask them to me if that's the best way. You let me know what's the best way to do this.
Yeah, for sure. You guys can just unmute yourself to ask questions. If you're shy, type in the chat, I can ask it for you. But so we don't have any questions. I do have some questions for you, Graham.
Sure.
I'm just like more so interested in like the techniques of acoustic recording. So, when somebody's, let's say in the singer-songwriter scenario, you have a singer and a guitar. Is there like a technique that you would use to place a microphone, and what kind of microphone should you use?
So that's a great scenario because, like you say, there's two instruments happening at the same time there, right? And there's so many options. Probably the most popular modern way to record a singer-songwriter would be to record probably a scratch track or a guide track first, maybe using a click track in the headphones, and record someone playing guitar and singing, and then to replace the guitar and then replace the vocal with a clean take that doesn't have the sound of the other instrument in it. That's a really sort of contemporary technique, and it's done to give the maximum control over each of those sound sources. But that's not the only way, and an equally valid approach, even if it is a bit more old school, would be to record both of those instruments at the same time, to the best degree that you can to get the best tone. And it could be like, there's just so many, I could talk your ear off for an hour on techniques of doing that. The most simple would be to choose one microphone that sounds great on guitar and vocal, find a great piece of air in front of the performer that balances naturally the voice and the guitar, and just record it to one track, and boom, you're done. On a good day, you're done. I think an important thing, whatever the technique is for the musician to hear not how they sound in the room, but how they sound in the recording, because this is a skill for musicians, performing to a microphone that's really different from performing to an audience of people. And again, I think about it in terms of theatrical performance on stage as an actor, playing to the back rows compared to filming a movie. Obviously, really different workflows and considerations there. So as much as it's up to a recording engineer to capture a great sound, it's really up to a musician to perform to a microphone as opposed to performing for the stage, or which might be what they're used to. So I think that's where a producer's job is really important in terms of laying that out for a musician, or helping them through that process, making it as natural as possible, or as comfortable as possible in what's sort of an inherently uncomfortable, we call it red light fever. Suddenly the tape's rolling or the computer is going and you're in front of the mic and the nerves come out. As far as the actual recording technique, I'm just going to get specific on one, which you may or may not have heard of, that I use often in this scenario. One mic is great if you can get it balanced, but if you're going to use two microphones, you've got some problems to contend with. One is the sound of the guitar is going to be in the vocal microphone, and the sound of the vocal is going to be in the guitar microphone. So a way to kind of mitigate the spill into the mics, but also get good sound on each of those sources would be to use a pair of microphones with a figure 8 polar pattern. Now, if you haven't heard of a polar pattern before, microphones can be unidirectional or often cardioid, but unidirectional would be a little bit more of the, the lay term for that, which means that it records sound that's in front of the microphone. And then you have an omnidirectional microphone that records sound from 360 degrees around that microphone. Then you have some special mics that have something called a bidirectional or figure-8 polar pattern, like I just said, records sound from the front and the back of the microphone. Now, the really important thing about a figure-8 microphone, if you imagine a figure-8, you can see obviously where the front and back of the mic are, but where my fingertips are touching, that's where the microphone is least sensitive, where it records almost no sound. It's a very deep null, is what we would say. And if you imagine a pair of these microphones, and go sideways here, if I position it so that the positive lobe of the figure-8 microphone is focused on the singer's mouth, you can see that the null is actually going to be pointed where the guitar is. Is that clear? And similarly, if you have another figure-8 microphone pointed at the guitar, you can see that null, which is at 90 degrees, right, to the positive lobe, is pointed at the singer's mouth. So if you want to have an adventure in recording engineering, get yourself a pair of figure-8 microphones from somewhere and take a listen to just how little sound is picked up when you position a sound source in the null of that microphone. And I mean, you kind of asked the golden question right out of the gates. That's the key right there, everybody. How much sound, what sound do you record with the mic you choose, and how much sound can you not record with that microphone? Then fill up a room with musicians, put 24 inputs on your sheet and do that 24 times. Now you're making a record. I see that there are a few questions in the chat. So I'm going to quickly, but not casually, go through these. One piece of advice you'd give to your younger self regarding your music career: start early and often. And I think in any creative field, it's really important to know you're going to hear the word no a lot. No, you can't do it like that. No, that's not how it's done. That's not good. That can be a really useful thing to hear, but you should never let it stop you from doing things, because, as I think I mentioned a couple of times, the aesthetics of music recording are so important. And where are you going to learn about aesthetics? You're going to learn about it by doing things yourself as a musician or as an engineer or producer. And it's really important to try your best at all times. And it's really important that you are honest with yourself about the results, because you're not always going to be pleased with them. And you have to use those fails to learn from and build on. And just because someone's saying no doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. I mean, if I say no, don't use that microphone there, it probably means you shouldn't do it. But a no for somebody, I have learned from experience, often means that didn't work for them, but it might work for you. And I can tell you a whole bunch of really creative recording professionals that do things that all of the textbooks say you shouldn't do. So are the Bell Studios free for students? No, the studios at the National Music Center, we are a charity. I should have mentioned this before, a not-for-profit organization. So there is a studio fee to use the studios, and that fee goes towards maintaining the living collection, right? To keeping all those instruments. Well, first of all, it goes to keeping the lights on, paying staff, and then really importantly, the studio fees go towards maintaining the instruments and the studio spaces, keeping those available and accessible to, we hope, generations of musicians to come. Having said that, there are some subsidized recording opportunities there. They're called artist in residence programs. And most years, the National Music Center runs several artist in residence programs, which you can find out about on the NMC website, on the Studio Bell website. Studio Bell, by the way, is the name of the building. The National Music Center is the name of the organization. Artist in residence, look it up and keep an eye on the website if you're interested, or if you have friends who would be interested in any of those opportunities, because those are by application and happen several times a year. What albums have you been inspired by recently? I mean, so many. You know what? I was doing a project a couple of weeks ago where I was listening to the artist's reference tracks were, oh man, I can't remember this singer's last name right now, but the singer for the band Big Thief, which I love their records. And this was the first time I had listened to, oh, Lenker, Adrienne Lenker was the first time I had listened to her solo recordings, which are really beautiful sounding, first of all, beautiful songs, and then beautifully recorded, mostly guitar and acoustic guitar and voice, like quite stripped back singer-songwriter stuff. So I thought, especially relative to that project, that was really inspiring recording. What kind of equipment, software, and plugins do you use the most when making music? I use Pro Tools every single day. And that's maybe not the most inspiring thing that I use every single day, but it's the platform that I record and mix with every day. If you were to ask me what is my favorite, I probably couldn't name one, but I would say a great microphone is a really inspiring tool for me personally, because it's like the lens on a camera. It really does have a profound impact on the sound that you capture. What is your favorite instrument to record live with versus your least favorite? Well, I don't have any least favorite because every instrument is amazing, but there are some that are more challenging. I think I already mentioned double bass. I often find to be the most challenging because of the low frequencies that you're trying to capture, and also the fact that you're trying to capture them probably in the context of other instruments that are much louder than a double bass. And I'm going to default here and say that my favorite instrument to record is often drums, because it's so fun, because you get to use so many microphones, or sometimes just one. Again, if you can do the job with one, that's a good day at the studio. When would you opt for digital instrument in place of an acoustic instrument? When I didn't, the only time that would be my first choice, if you're talking about like a software version of a piano or a software synth or something, the only time I would ever choose a digital instrument first would be if there wasn't a good sounding acoustic option available where I had to do the recording. Second answer would be if it's a piano or keyboard instrument and the keyboardist is not an extremely good pianist, and then I would maybe choose a digital option so that I could record MIDI and have some additional control over the performance. But typically, if you got a good musician and a good instrument, that's where the fun starts. And that's when you get out the mics. There are lots of opportunities for people interested in a career in music. Yes, there are lots of opportunities, but they are a lot different than they used to be. And it's always a bit of a struggle for me to answer this question, because I want to be honest. There are not a lot of job opportunities in a professional recording studio like what you just saw. But if that's something you're passionate about, I would never discourage anyone from pursuing that. But the opportunities in music, I think there's more new music released in a day on Spotify than there was in whole years put together in the 80s and 90s. So there is a demand for new music. There's a demand for new recordings. But in a way, it's the opposite problem, right? Where there's a saturation of content. And so it's all about trying to get your voice heard, whether you're an artist or whether you're a producer. I think there's also tons of opportunities in the back end of things. I mean, even more behind the scenes stuff than what I do in terms of developing technology. Music technology is a huge, huge field, and frankly, more lucrative than a lot of performance or recording type positions or roles. How would you suggest the best way to get involved in the field, even if they're in an unrelated program? Well, what you're doing today is probably a great way to start in terms of finding like-minded people and looking for volunteer opportunities and clubs. I think that's a really great way to start. And I would say that there is also, there are still, by the way, entry-level positions in studios and in music organizations available. It's just that there's a lot of competition for those. And so I had already mentioned the training program at the Banff Center. There are professional training programs, at either private colleges like OIART, where I went, or McGill and University of Lethbridge universities have respectively master's and undergraduate level recording programs. And then lots of digital media and digital audio training programs at other universities and colleges as well, if you're more interested in this sort of developing the tools side of things. And if it's actually performance that you're talking about, it sort of depends on whether you are doing original compositions or pursuing like sort of a session musician or orchestral musician type career. In the orchestral world, of course, it's a real rigid pedagogical path. And in terms of being a session musician, it's really about learning all the instruments as best you can and convincing that first person to pay you to play on their record. And trust me, if a good session musician shows up for a session that I do, I keep their name around, because a great session musician in the studio is worth their weight in gold, both for a producer and for an artist that is able to hire them for their project. Wow, that was a lot of talking from you guys. I hope some of it was interesting enough to make that a good hour of your time.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. That was amazing.
I would really, really encourage you guys to check out those other links in those rooms on the virtual tour links that's earlier in the chat. And by the way, I would love to, if I didn't have a chance to answer your question and you had something you wanted to follow up with, I think Tony and Tyler can direct you to my NMC email. I would be happy to receive your messages and answer an email if that would. So yeah, just look me up that way.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. If you want to reach us to Graham, just DM us or email us, and I can provide you the contact information. But I think that will be it for the masterclass. Thank you, Graham, again for doing this, and it's been amazing.
You're very welcome. Okay, bye everybody.
See you, everyone.